Elena Osei had never planned to spend Christmas in Korea. She had planned to spend it in Accra, eating her grandmother's kelaweel, arguing with her cousins over who burned the rice, and falling asleep on the couch during the fourth replay of a film she already had memorized. That was the plan. Warm, loud, and deeply familiar. But life does not always honor your plans. And so she found herself in Seoul, South Korea, dressed in a black and white uniform that sat slightly too wide at the shoulders, pushing a mop across floors so polished they reflected her face back at her like a question she had not yet answered. But wait, before we go any further, stop right here, because what you are about to witness is not simply a love story. It begins with a mop and a Christmas morning, and it ends with a man who has not felt anything in years standing alone in a hallway at 2 in the morning, holding a small wrap package like it is the most dangerous thing he has ever touched. And this man has touched very dangerous things. So do not skip ahead. Do not rush this. Stay here. Watch every single second because every scene matters. When you finish, leave a comment telling me which moment crack you open first. Then hit like and subscribe because this channel is just beginning and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Now, let's go back to Elena. Elena Osei was 24 years old, 5'4", and had the kind of face that made people unsure whether she was deeply kind or silently calculating. She was usually both. She wore her natural hair in a protective style most days, her skin a deep and even brown that caught light warmly, and she had a mouth that ran slightly ahead of her better judgment on occasion. She had arrived in Seoul on a 1-year contract through an international domestic staffing agency that placed workers with high-profile clients. The pay was exceptional. The client was listed simply as R. Jang. The agency had told her 3 things. 1. He valued silence. 2. He valued order. 3. She was the 9th housekeeper placed in his residence in 14 months. Elena had stared at that third detail for a long time. 9 people. 14 months. She had done the math. 1 person every 6 weeks, roughly. She almost withdrew her application. But then she thought about her mother's hospital bills, checked her account balance, and told herself she was not going to be maid number 9 who left. She was going to be maid number 9 who stayed. What the agency had not told her was that R. Jang stood for Ren Jang-ho. And Ren Jang-ho was not simply a wealthy man with exacting standards. He was the head of the Jang organization, one of the most feared criminal networks in South Korea, and depending on who you asked, in several neighboring countries as well. He was 31 years old. Ink covered him from the base of his throat all the way down both arms, disappearing beneath his collar and cuffs in a way that made you sharply aware you were only seeing the beginning of something far larger. He had a jaw that looked like it had been sculpted by someone in a bad mood who took it out on stone. He spoke in low, measured tones that made grown men check their own pulse afterward just to confirm they were still there. He did not celebrate Christmas. He did not celebrate anything. Actually, his head of security, a compact and permanently tired man named Min Jae, had once attempted to arrange a small gathering for Ren's 30th birthday. Ren had looked at the decorations, then at Min Jae. Min Jae had taken them down himself before a single word was spoken. That was the kind of man Ren Jang-ho was. Elena arrived on a Thursday in late November, pulling 1 large suitcase and 1 overpacked carry-on up a driveway that was longer than the entire road she had grown up on. The property was not a house. It was a compound. There were gates. There were cameras. There were 2 men at the entrance who assessed her the way people assess something unfamiliar that might or might not be a threat. She smiled at them. They did not smile back. She decided that was fine and walked through anyway. The head housekeeper who showed her around was a Korean woman in her 50s named Mrs. Song. She moved through the property with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived a great deal and intended to survive considerably more. She walked Elena through the kitchen, the east wing, the private corridor, which Elena was never to enter without being summoned, the grounds, the laundry, and the staff quarters, which were surprisingly comfortable. Elena said so aloud. Mrs. Song looked at her and said flatly, "He is not cheap. He is difficult." Elena nodded slowly. "What is the difference?" Mrs. Song almost smiled. "Almost. You will find out." The first time Elena saw Ren Kang was on her third day. She was polishing the tall glass panels in the main corridor, earphones in, moving to a rhythm only she could hear when she turned around and nearly walked directly into his chest. She stumbled. Her cloth hit the glass. One earphone fell. She caught it. She looked up. He was taller than she had imagined. The tattoos were visible at his collar and both wrists. He wore a dark suit without a tie and looked at her the way a man looks at a mark on an otherwise clean surface. Not with anger, just noting it. "You are the new one," he said. His English was unhurried and precise. "Yes," Elena said. "Elena Osei. I arrived on Thursday." He said nothing to that. He looked at the glass panel, then at her, then walked past her without another word. Elena stood still for a moment. There was a new smudge on the glass where her cloth had struck it. She stared at it. "Wonderful," she said under her breath. "Outstanding first impression, Elena." She polished it away and went back to work. The weeks that followed settled into rhythm. Elena learned the compound the way you learn a new language, slowly, then all at once. She learned that Ren woke before 6 and expected black coffee, no sugar, waiting in the study before he arrived. She learned that he ate in silence and did not want to be asked whether the food was good, because if it was not, he would simply stop eating it. She learned that the men who came to his late meetings never quite looked comfortable when they left. She learned to be invisible in the particular way the role required, present enough to be useful, absent enough to go unregistered. But Elena Osei had never been fully invisible in her life. It was structurally impossible, not because she sought attention, but because she talked to herself when she worked. She hummed. She laughed at her own thoughts with a short, genuine sound when something struck her as funny, which happened more often than was perhaps appropriate for someone in her position. The first time Ren heard her laugh, he had paused outside the kitchen doorway, without her knowledge. She was organizing the pantry shelves and had apparently thought of something that genuinely delighted her because she laughed, clean and real, and said aloud, "No, Elena, that is absolutely not how that works." Then laughed again. He stood there for approximately 4 seconds before walking away. He did not examine why he had paused. December arrived in Seoul with a cold that had teeth. Elena layered herself in everything she owned and bought a thick scarf from a market near the compound that she wore on her days off. She video called her mother twice a week, always from her room, always in the evenings, always with the volume low, because she had survived 9 weeks and intended to keep surviving. Her mother, Grace Osei, was the kind of woman who had lived through enough that very little shook her, but who still welled up every time she saw her daughter's face on a phone screen from another continent. She always opened the same way. "Elena, are you eating?" And Elena always said yes, even when the truth was complicated by the fact that she sometimes forgot her own dinner after spending the evening ensuring the house was ready for the next morning. "Tell me about where you are," Grace would say. "It is very large, Mama. Very quiet. Is the man kind?" Elena paused. "He is professional." Her mother made a sound. The sound of a woman who was not convinced but had chosen not to press. He is not cruel, Mama. He simply does not talk much. Does not talk. But does not talk to you." Elena thought about that one. It was a sharper question than it appeared. Ren did talk. She had heard him in meetings, low and controlled. She had once passed the corridor outside his study and heard him on the phone in Korean, perfectly calm, while the voice on the other end was clearly not. He could speak. He simply did not direct much of it at her, beyond instruction and correction, and occasionally a nod when something had been done correctly, which she had come to understand was, in his specific economy of expression, something close to praise. "He talks," Elena said, "just not usually to me." "Then," said Grace Osei, "make yourself impossible to ignore." Elena smiled at the screen. "Mama, I am his housekeeper, and your grandmother carried firewood to market for years," Grace said without flinching. "And your grandfather walked 3 days on foot to come back to her. Position is not the story, Elena. You are the story." Elena held that thought long after the call ended. It was the second week of December when Elena made her decision about Christmas. She had been turning it over quietly, the way she turned over things she was not certain were wise, which is to say, constantly, privately, and without telling anyone. The compound was entirely undecorated. No lights, no ornaments, not even a single festive plant on a windowsill to acknowledge the season. Mrs. Song had made it plain early on, no decorations, no holiday music in the shared spaces, do not raise the subject. But Elena was not thinking about decorations. She was thinking about something far smaller and far more precise. She had noticed a thing about Ren sometime in November, quietly and without trying to. She was a person to whom observation came as naturally as breath. She noticed that every time he walked past the large abstract painting in the East Corridor, a deep, layered piece in blues and warm gold that felt like something remembered from a distance, he slowed. Not long. Not enough that anyone who was not watching carefully would register it. But he always slowed. She had stood before that painting one morning while cleaning and felt it herself. The weight of it. The way it seemed to hold something private. She looked it up over 4 evenings, searching carefully through image databases and Korean art archives with the patience of someone raised to make the most of limited resources and limited time. She found it eventually. The artist's name was Han Ji-soo, who had passed away some years prior and whose work had been written about in several serious publications. One article mentioned that Han Ji-soo had produced a series of intimate companion sketches alongside several of his major canvases. Pencil drawings that explored the same interior world as the paintings, but quieter, more personal. Most were in private collections. A few had never sold. Elena used her own money. She found a gallery holding one sketch from that companion series, made contact through several careful and polite emails, negotiated patiently, and had it shipped to the compound addressed to herself. She signed for it on a morning when Ron was in meetings. She wrapped it herself in plain, deep blue paper. She wrote a card. She wrote his name on the outside. Inside, she wrote only, "I noticed you always slow down. I hope it means what I think it means." She did not explain herself further. Just her name, Elena. She placed it on the table outside his study at 5:40 in the morning on December 24th, before the coffee was made, before the house stirred. She had a brief and entirely silent argument with herself in that corridor about whether this was a reasonable thing to be doing. Then she set it down, walked away, and went to make the coffee. She was not there when he found it. She had made herself deliberately busy on the far side of the compound, cleaning things that did not urgently require attention, the way you keep your hands occupied when you have done something slightly terrifying. Ren came to the table at 6:14. He read his name on the card. He stood very still for a moment. He carried it into his study and closed the door. He opened the card first, read it twice. He opened a wrapping with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to approach unexpected things slowly. When he saw what it was, he sat down. Not at his desk. On the edge of his desk, the way you sit when something has briefly removed the steadiness from your legs. Han Ji-soo, a companion sketch to the painting in the corridor. His mother had bought that painting. She had brought him to the gallery the year he turned 8, pointed at it, and said, "Look, Jang Ho-ya. This is what I mean when I say real art is not something to hang on a wall. It is a feeling someone caught before it ran away." His mother had been gone for 11 years. Ren sat on the edge of his desk in the early morning quiet of his study for a long time. Min-jae found out about the gift before noon because Min-jae found out about everything. He came to stand beside Run in the garden mid-morning, where Run was holding coffee and looking at nothing in particular. "The housekeeper left something for you this morning," Min-jae said, testing the temperature carefully. "I know. She paid for it herself. I verified." Ren said nothing. "It belongs to the Han Ji-soo Companion series," Min-jae continued, because he had done his own research by this point. She traced it herself, through galleries and old archives. It took her several weeks, based on the correspondence records. He paused. There is no note asking for anything. No request for a bonus or a favor or... Min-jae. "Yes, I know." Min-jae went quiet, then said, carefully, "She is the longest-serving staff member we have had in over a year." Ren turned his head slightly. "Why are you telling me what I already know? I am building toward a point." then arrive there faster. Min-jae exhaled the breath of a man who had accepted a job and had not fully anticipated what the total scope of that job would eventually include. My point, he said, is that she is different from all the others, and you already know that. I am simply saying it aloud, so that at least one of us has. Ren looked back at the garden. The cold had stripped most of the color from it. Go do your work, he said. Min-jae went. He was smiling when he walked away, and he made very sure Ren did not see that. Elena spent Christmas Day on her usual duties because no one had told her otherwise, and she was not going to assume. She called her mother in the morning, and they spoke for 40 minutes, and she felt the particular sweetness and ache of being loved from very far away. She ate a small meal in the staff quarters that Mrs. Song had quietly ensured included something warm and nourishing, which Elena found so unexpectedly touching that she had to sit with herself for a moment before she could eat. She was in the East Corridor that afternoon, doing a light pass over the surfaces when she heard footsteps and turned to find Ren standing behind her. This was unusual. He did not seek her out. Instructions came through Mrs. Song or in the morning. She straightened. Good afternoon. He looked at her, then at the painting, then back at her. How did you find it? He said. It had the shape of a question, but not the uncertainty. I searched, she said, online, through art records. It took a few evenings. I found articles about the artist, and one of them mentioned the companion pieces, and she stopped herself. She had a habit of over-explaining when she was nervous. I just wanted to find something that made sense, she said simply. He was quiet. He was looking at her in a way she had not seen him look at anyone in the week she had been here. Not the measuring neutrality he gave to everything. Something more precise than that. The beginning of genuine curiosity. Why, he said. Why what? Why did you do it? She had thought about this. She had prepared several sensible, professional answers. She used none of them. Because it was Christmas, she said, and you looked like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be given something that had nothing to do with strategy. The corridor held the silence for a long moment. Then he said, Merry Christmas, Osei. Her last name. She was almost certain it was the first time. He walked away. She turned back to her work and exhaled very slowly through her nose, like someone who has just cleared a threshold they were not sure they would clear. All right, she said quietly. All right. Something shifted in the compound after that. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not paying close attention. Ren began to notice things about Elena. He noticed that her humming changed with her mood, quicker when she was moving through tasks efficiently, slower and more layered when she was doing something that required focus. He noticed that she narrated her own day under her breath in a way that was not quite talking to herself and not quite performing for an invisible audience, but something warmly in between. He once heard her step back from a freshly organized kitchen shelf, observe it, and say with complete sincerity, Elena, Osei, nobody else alive could arrange this pantry this well. This is a work of genuine art. Then nod, satisfied, and move on. He stood outside the kitchen doorway for 11 seconds that time. He had not decided to pay attention to her. It was not a choice he made consciously. It was something that happened the way certain things happen, incrementally, and then entirely, with no clean point of origin you could go back and mark. Min-jae noticed. He said nothing. He stored it, the way he stored everything, and waited. In the first week of January, Ren spoke to her beyond what was necessary. She was in the garden at an early hour, which surprised him. He had come outside for a separate reason and stopped when he found her there. She was standing near the bare winter section of the grounds in her coat and scarf, holding a mug, looking up at the sky. She heard him and turned. Good morning. What are you doing out here? He looked up at the sky. It was low and gray and even. There is always something, she said without apology. Right now, there is that particular shade that comes just before it decides to snow. I grew up in Accra. We did not get snow, so I like to watch it deciding. He did not leave. That itself was notable, though neither of them acknowledged it. Accra, he said after a moment. Ghana. People do not always know that, she said, unbothered. A pause. What are you drinking? She looked at her mug. Ginger tea with honey. Mrs. Song showed me where you keep the good honey. I hope that is all right. The honey is not restricted. Good, because I had 3 mugs yesterday. Something moved in his face. Not a smile. The thing that lives just before a smile, when the muscles register that the concept of amusement has arrived nearby. It is going to snow, he said. I know, she said. That is why I am here. He stood with her in the garden for 4 more minutes before going inside. She stayed another 10. When he passed the window in the corridor facing the garden, he looked out once. She was still there, her breath making small clouds, waiting for the snow to make its decision. It snowed that afternoon. She was working inside when it started. He heard, from his study, the sound of someone in the corridor making a brief sound of delight, and then quiet, and then the sound of her returning to work. He did not look up from his desk, but something had settled in his expression that had not been there an hour before. The note exchange happened in the 3rd week of January and changed the texture of the air between them permanently. He had appeared in the kitchen one evening, unusual given the hour, and found her eating a late meal she had made for herself. What is that? He said. She looked at her plate. Jollof rice. I made it. I found most of the ingredients near the East Gate and substituted 2 things I could not find. I think it still came out well, though my grandmother would have opinions about the substitutions. He came to stand at the kitchen counter, looked at the plate. Jollof rice, he repeated. West African, she said. My grandmother brought the recipe. It is serious business in my family. There are arguments at every gathering. My cousin thinks he makes it better than she does. He is wrong, but we let him believe it. It keeps him occupied. The pre-smile thing moved in his face again. She was learning its gradations. Make enough for 2 next time, he said, and walked out. She stared at the doorway, then at her plate, then back at the doorway. Okay, she said slowly. That happened. 3 days later, she made jollof rice and left his portion plated and covered in the warming section with a note that read, Here. The rice has been treated with full respect. Your ancestors will find nothing to object to. She looked at it, decided it was accurate, and left it. He ate it. She knew because the plate was in the dish rack the next morning, clean and rinsed in the way of someone raised to clean up after themselves. There was a sticky note on it. She nearly dropped the plate. The note said it was good. What did you substitute? She wrote back and left it by his morning coffee. Tomato paste for the fresh tomatoes and a local chili instead of the proper pepper. My grandmother does not know. This stays between us. She found his response 3 hours later on the pantry door. Noted. She stood holding the pantry door, being more delighted by this than she could rationally explain. Min-jae walked in, saw her expression, read the note, and looked at her with something that lived between professional composure and genuine entertainment. Min-jae, she said, does he leave notes? In 7 years, Min-jae said precisely, he has never left a note for anyone about anything. She looked at the note again. Interesting. Very, said Min-jae. 20 minutes later, Min-jae found Ren in his study and stood in the doorway until Ren looked up. Do not, said Ren. I was not going to say anything. You were going to say several things. Min-jae paused. I was going to mention that Mrs. Song had a question about the... That is not what you were going to say. Another pause. No, Min-jae admitted. It was not. Go away, Min-jae. Going, said Min-jae and went, smiling. February arrived, and with it a cold that felt like the city holding its breath. By then, what existed between Elena and Ren had grown into something that did not fit available categories. Not friendship exactly, though it had the bones of one. Not professional, though they behaved as though it was. It was a conversation that had started in a corridor in December and had not stopped, even on the days when no words passed between them at all. They talked in the evenings sometimes about small things that were really large things spoken sideways. She told him about growing up with her mother and grandmother, about how her grandmother would rise before dawn and cook so the whole house smelled like something good before anyone was fully awake. He listened in the way of a man who had forgotten he enjoyed listening. He told her once about a week he had spent in Tokyo as a young man, before everything that followed. He had walked until his feet remembered what it felt like to belong to nothing but themselves. She said, Did you want to stay? He looked at her. In Tokyo, in a life where no one knew you. The room was quiet. That is not a question most people would ask, he said. I am not most people. No, he said. You are not. It was the most direct thing he had said to her that was not an instruction. She folded it away somewhere private. The trouble came from outside, as it always did in Ren's life. A rival organization had been increasing pressure for months. Ren's response to this was externally composed. Internally, he was running on very little sleep and a cold, contained fury that was his version of being stretched thin. Elena noticed. She noticed how the coffee disappeared faster on certain mornings, how Min-jae's exhaustion had deepened, how meetings ran late and left tension hanging in the air of hallways. She said nothing. It was not her place, and she was not naive about the world she had entered with open eyes. But on a night in late February, passing the corridor outside his study and hearing the specific quality of silence that meant someone sitting alone in a room at midnight with something heavy on them, she did something unplanned. She knocked. A pause. What? I have tea. Another pause. You do not have to. I know. He opened the door. She was in her off-duty clothes, her hair down, her market scarf still wrapped around her neck, 2 mugs in her hands. He stepped aside. She came in. She placed 1 mug on his desk without ceremony, looked once at the papers spread across it without looking too closely, and sat in the chair across from him when he offered it. The chair probably usually reserved for people considerably more dangerous than her. They sat in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind with warmth in it, which was the kind she was good at holding. Then he said, Monroe. Elena, she said. He looked at her. What? My name is Elena. You can use it. Something moved across his face. He said it. Elena. The first time, and it landed differently than anything else he had said to her, because there was care in how he said it, like something new in his mouth that he wanted to get right. She nodded, looked at her tea. After a while he said, I am not a straightforward person to be around. I noticed, she said without judgment. I'm not asking about what you do. You should ask, he said. It should matter to you. She looked at him steadily. She understood what he was doing. This was a man warning her, telling her the reason he did not believe he deserved to have someone sit with him at midnight and drink tea. I have spent my life around complicated people, she said. My grandfather crossed borders and started over with nothing. My mother worked without rest for years and never let us feel the weight of it. Complicated is not a flaw I'm trying to see past. Run. I'm not here looking for something easy. Easy was never what I came for. She had used his name. For the first time, he heard it the way she had heard hers. Neither of them spoke about what was happening. There were not yet words built for it. Only the beginning of a shared understanding that something had arrived, had been arriving for months, and was not going anywhere. She left at 1 a.m. He walked her to the corridor without being asked, and stood in the doorway as she went. She turned once at the far end. Good night, Ron. Good night, Elena. Min-jae's cameras, as Min-jae would quietly note to himself the next morning, recorded that Ren stood in that doorway for 45 seconds after she turned the corner and disappeared. Min-jae said nothing about this. He went about his morning with the specific satisfaction of a man who has been watching something arrive for a long time and is glad to finally see it. March came in with a change in the quality of light. Still cold, but the cold was beginning to negotiate its exit. Elena had kept up her early morning walks to the garden, and Ren had begun joining them with a casualness that convinced no one who was paying attention. On a Tuesday morning in early March, they were walking, and she was mid-sentence, telling him about a dish she wanted to try that required an ingredient she had not yet found. When he stopped walking, she stopped a few steps ahead and turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the cool assessment of the first months. Not the measured curiosity of the middle months. Something more open. Something he had not had time to prepare for, because he had not seen it coming soon enough. Elena, he said. She waited. What you said in February, he said, about not looking for easy. Yes. I want you to know, he said. He paused. For a man who spoke in full, controlled sentences, the pause meant something. I want you to know that I am aware of what this is. She held very still. What is this? He looked at her steadily. He was Ren Kang. He had run a feared organization for 8 years. He had faced down things far more dangerous than this moment. He did not flinch, but he said it carefully, with the care of someone saying something they have not said in a very long time and do not want to get wrong. Something I did not plan for, he said. Something I notice. Something that is significant. She breathed. Run, she said, with patience and warmth. Are you telling me that you have feelings for me in the most complicated way possible? He looked at her. Yes. You could have just said that. I could not have said that without saying the other part first. So that I understand the cost, she said quietly. What being near you might mean. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, about Grace Osei working without complaint for years, about a grandfather who walked 3 days on foot to return to the woman he loved. She thought about a painting in a corridor and a man who always slowed down when he passed it, about midnight tea and a sticky note on a pantry door that had delighted her more than it had any right to. I told you, she said. I did not come to Seoul looking for easy. I came here and I found something I was not looking for. And the fact that it is not simple is not the obstacle you think it is. He closed a short distance between them. Up close, the ink at his collar was intricate and dark, and his face was the face she had come to know over months, the controlled stillness of it, and the things beneath the stillness that she had learned to read. The quiet humor, the weight he carried, the grief that lived in him like a tenant he had stopped arguing with. She found him one of the most beautiful things she had ever given her full attention to. He raised his hand. She watched him decide to touch her face, watched the decision happen in real time. And then his hand was there, warm in the cold morning air, his thumb resting at the edge of her cheek. Elena, he said. Right here, she said. He kissed her, unhurried, in the pale March garden, while the city moved beyond the compound walls and somewhere across the world in Accra. A woman named Grace Osei would later say she had felt something settle in her chest at that exact hour without knowing why, which was exactly the kind of thing Grace Osei said, and which Elena believed completely. They stood in the garden for a moment afterward, close, his hand still warm at her face. Then she said, I still need that ingredient for the dish. He pulled back and looked at her. Now, not this second, but today. Something broke open in his face. Finally a real smile. Small, unperformed, and completely real. She suspected very few people had ever been standing in front of it when it arrived. It felt, facing it, like a window that had always been closed and had been open for the first time. Min Jae will find it, he said. Min Jae finds everything. He does, she agreed. He lowered his hand. He was still looking at her in the new way. The way of a man who has said the thing and is standing in the world after having said it, and is finding the world less dangerous than he feared. Come inside, he said. It is cold. I know, she said. I was waiting for you to notice. He gave her a look she now understood was his version of being entirely charmed. She filed it away with everything else she was still learning about him. They went inside. In his study, hung on the wall beside the bookcase, the Han Jiaisu sketch rested in a simple frame. He had hung it himself on the morning after Christmas. Min Jae had seen it there and said nothing because some things deserve to be honored with silence. The pencil lines caught the winter light from the window, small and still and full of what great art carries and refuses to surrender. A feeling someone caught before it could escape. Elena had found it through 4 evenings of careful searching and given it to a man who had not expected it and had not asked for it. She had not known then what she was beginning. You never know what you are beginning when you start with something true. She knew now. And that is where we leave them. A Tuesday morning in March, inside a warm compound in Seoul. A man who is smiling for the first time in years. A woman who always knew that something real was worth the wait. Now I need to hear from you. Which moment got you? Was it the Christmas morning gift and what it meant about his mother? Was it the pantry note that was supposedly simple but was everything? Was it midnight tea and the way she said you can use my name? Or was it the garden in March and that smile, the small, real, long overdue one? Tell me in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if you found this story today, subscribe immediately because this is what this channel does. Every video is a complete world. Every story is a complete feeling. And we are just getting started. Like this video if Elena and Ren earned every bit of what found them. They did. You know they did. See you in the next one.